Okay, so today, or this lecture is going to be 2.2.2, which is going to be the lithosphere. Key question 2, in earthquakes, we're looking at differences in effects in MEDCs versus LEDCs, more economically developed countries versus less economically developed countries. So, economic diversity might seem like something that doesn't really fit into a discussion about earthquakes, especially when we're just talking about how earthquakes happen. But environmental management requires us to not only take into account what happens to the land, but what happens to the people. And that very much is dependent on the level of economic security in that country. So the differences and impacts between LEDCs and MEDCs clearly show us that we need to bring some kind of level in order to minimize the impact that they have on the human population. So let's take a look at these two really quick. Just going to glance over these since you are supposed to read these two. I just want to give an overview of them, and we're going to watch an entire video on the Haiti earthquake, which was devastating. Let's take a look at Christchurch first, which is an MEDC. All right. So, if we look at this, the earthquake struck on February 22nd, 2011. So it's going to be really close to the time that the Haiti earthquake happened. It was a 6.3 magnitude earthquake. Keep that in mind. And the focus was very shallow at 4.99 kilometers deep. The more shallow your focus, the less distance that the waves have to travel to reach the surface. So usually the more devastating it is. The earthquake happened at a conservative plate margin or a transform plate boundary between the Pacific plate and Australian plate. So the primary effects, and please keep these in mind when we look at the other ones. 181 people were killed, 2,000 injured, over 50% of the city's buildings were damaged. The city's cathedral spire collapsed, and water and sewage pipes were damaged. Sounds pretty bad, but not devastating, right? Secondary effects from the primary effects were businesses were closed for a long time. Christchurch couldn't afford to hold the five Rugby World Cup matches it was supposed to hold. And schools were closed for 2 weeks due to the damage. Again, hard things, not impossible. Short-term responses was international aid very quickly, around $67 million. Aid workers came from charities such as the Red Cross. Areas were zoned to assess damage, and 300 Australian police officers were flown in to help. Long term is that there were $898 million in building insurance claims. The water and sewage were restored by August. So this happened let's look at that again. This happened in February. Everything was good to go by August. I mean, that's a long time, but we're going to see in Haiti how much different that was. And temporary housing was provided for people. And you can see in New Zealand where it's happened, in Christchurch, you can see where that earthquake happened and where it went out from. All right? So that's pretty much the stuff on Christchurch. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at the same thing on Haiti, which is an LEDC. All right? So Haiti. Now, the earthquake was a decent bit larger, 6.3 to 7.0. The 7.0s are not unheard of. 7.0s, it's not the 9s are the one every 10 to 15 years. So this is 100 times smaller than a 9.0. Still really strong, but shouldn't have leveled the city, but it did, right? So this happened at a destructive plate margin, so this was a convergent boundary between the Caribbean and North American plates. The focus was only 12.87 kilometers deep. So this is really shallow, and the epicenter was just 25.75 kilometers from the capital. So that definitely played into it where the focus was. Now, here's the deal, right? We talked about very small compared to this amount of people being killed in Christchurch. 220,000 people killed and 300,000 people injured. So over 500,000 people directly impacted by this, by either being killed or injured. And what did they die from? Did they die from the shaking? Absolutely not. They died from buildings collapsing because the buildings, one of the big things about LEDCs and MEDCs is that the building structure And an LEDC is usually built without governmental regulations or weak governmental regulations, so they don't have the ability to withstand an earthquake the way that Christchurch or any MEDC building structures would be. They're built relatively cheap and fast, and then when the earthquake happens, they crumble, and this is exactly what happened in Haiti. The main port was badly damaged. 8 hospitals collapsed, so imagine having all those people with nowhere to treat them. 100,000 houses were destroyed and 200,000 were damaged, and 1.3 million people became homeless like that. It's one of the biggest tragedies in human history, and we don't really talk about it much anymore. Secondary effects, 2 million people were without food and water. Frequent power cuts occurred, crime increased, looting became a problem, and sexual violence escalated. People moved into temporary shelters, and by November 2010, there were outbreaks of cholera. And cholera is a waterborne disease that can basically cause so much water loss from the human body that people die. Responses short term. Aid was slow to arrive to the damaged port. You know how Christchurch got their aid like right away, even though the United States and other countries are not too far from Haiti. The aid was super slow to arrive. We did end up sending rescue teams and 10,000 troops. Bottled water and purification tablets were provided. 235,000 people were moved to less damaged cities away from Port-au-Prince, which is the capital. Just imagine moving 235,000 people. It's crazy. And the UK government and governments around the world donated money as well. Long-term effect, Haiti was dependent on overseas aid. New homes were built to a higher standard, although the response was super slow. 1 year after the earthquake, over 1 million people were still living in temporary shelters. You know, everything was back to normal. Like we talked about the sewers, we talked about all these things being back to normal by August. We're like, oh man, it's a long time from February in Christchurch. Here, we're talking about a year later, people still homeless, right? And the port needed rebuilding, which required large amounts of investment. You can see where it happened in Haiti and how it came out. So those are definitely two differences. The big difference there is the economic development in those two areas. So MEDC obviously fares a lot better in an earthquake situation than the LEDC generally.